Hey guys, so let's move on and finish up Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So into the fourth part now. The first section's called the honey sacrifice. And basically here a number of years have passed since the third part. Zarathustra has just been chilling out on his mountain top. And he tells his animals that he's waiting for the sign that the time has come for him to descend again. I.e. go back down to the people and teach, I guess. And there is an interesting section here in regarding the ubermensch, where he says that, or he talks about the ubermensch as, quote, our great distant human kingdom. So just reinforcing this idea of the ubermensch as something that is coming in the future, not something that is that we can individually aspire to. Something kind of, it's like a descendants of our descendants kind of thing. The next section is called the cry of distress. Here Zarathustra is sitting outside his cave when he sees the soothsayer that we met way back in the second part. And this is the soothsayer who taught of a great weariness. And the quote I have is, all is the same, nothing is worthwhile, the world is without meaning, knowledge strangles. So that's what this soothsayer says. And essentially, I guess, there's the soothsayer must be emphasizing Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence. Everything's without meaning because everything just continually recycles. Everything that you experience now, you've experienced an infinite number of times in the past, and will experience an infinite number of times in the future. So there's that kind of nihilism, that feeling of pessimism as well. And the soothsayer foretells that waves of distress are coming for Zarathustra. And he asks him if he has heard it yet. And just at that moment, Zarathustra literally does hear a cry of distress. But he isn't worried about this that much after all. I mean, what is human distress to Zarathustra? What is the distress of the mob to him? But the soothsayer tells Zarathustra that the cry is for him, it's addressed to him, and urges him to go to it. And he says, and so we're building to the climax of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He says, or the soothsayer says that in imploring Zarathustra to go down to investigate this cry of distress, he has come to seduce you to your final sin. And this final sin is pity. So that's where we're headed with this. Zarathustra asks, who's calling? And the soothsayer says, it's the higher man. So Zarathustra's out to go, he disappears to go find this, the higher man who is in distress, and the soothsayer chills in Zarathustra's cave. So the next section is conversation with the kings, and the next several sections actually are just encountering people that Zarathustra meets on his way to find this higher man who's in distress. So the first of these sections is called Conversation with the Kings. Zarathustra runs across two men and a donkey, an ass. The men turn out to be kings, and they've left society because they've recognized how false and foul the mob are, and how much human society nauseates them. And even kings nowadays have become a shadow of their former selves. They've lost their nobility. They're nothing more now than representatives, the first in line, if you like, of the rabble. So they're not separate from them. And that's a common theme. It's a theme we've seen before in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, right? So they tell Zarathustra they're looking for him, and he invites them to his cave. They head up. He says he'll come and meet them later. He goes on looking for the higher man, and he finds in the leech, the next section, he finds a guy lying on the path. This guy has his arm in the swamp, and he's using it as bait, he says, looking for leeches. He is an expert on the brain of the leech, apparently. And he calls Zarathustra the great leech of the conscience. Presumably, I guess, because Zarathustra kind of attaches himself to people's consciences and forces them to kind of face uncomfortable truths. So he's acting like a conscience for people. And this guy, this leech specialist, well, specialist on the brain of the leech even, is a specialist because of what he represents. And he tells Zarathustra that he is the conscientious, in spirit. So that's his kind of position in this dialogue. And he believes, so being conscientious in spirit, he believes it's better to know nothing rather than half know much. The quote I have is, "The conscience of my spirit demands of me that I know one thing and nothing else. I loathe all the half in spirit." Zarathustra invites him back to his cave, and he goes on looking, searching. So the next guy he meets is a man who begins convulsing and trembling and waving his arms around. And he starts ranting about torture and pain, but then Zarathustra comes up and forces him to stop by beating him, as you do. And the guy admits, he gets Zarathustra to stop beating him and says he's a magician. He admits to being a magician who was merely playing the role of the ascetic of the spirit. And we've seen that ascetic attitude come up before, right? Nietzsche's strongly against this idea of asceticism and denying our passions. And the magician says that he is the poet and magician who at last turns his spirit against himself. Or that's the role he's playing anyway. Can you hear that? Anyway, Zarathustra accuses him of not just playing the role of an ascetic. He says he is actually something of an ascetic. And the magician admits this. He says, yeah, I'm sorry. I was pretending to be great when actually this is a lie. Zarathustra acknowledges the magician's honesty, sends him back to his cave, and he goes on. So the next guy he comes across is a tall man in black who says that he was looking for, quote, the last pious man, a sage and hermit who alone in his forest had not yet heard what all the world knows today. Namely, end quote there, end quote, namely, God is dead. That's the reference here. So the man in black turns out to be the last pope, and after God's death, doesn't know what to do anymore, right? Or after hearing the news that God is dead, he doesn't know what to do. So he was looking for a hermit in the forest, not Zarathustra, but this guy is also dead. So he decided instead to look for, quote, the most pious of all those who do not believe in God, end quote, and that is Zarathustra. So Zarathustra introduces himself, says, it's me, I'm here. And the last pope tells him some secrets about God that he gleaned while working so close with him. He says that God was addicted to secrecy, and even a son he got himself in a sneaky way. At the door of his faith stands adultery. It's a nice little jab at Christianity, and the Immaculate Conception of Mary. He admits also that anyone calling this God the God of love did not have a high enough opinion of love itself. He says, did this God not want to be a judge too? But the lover loves beyond reward and retribution. A dig there at God being a judger, God's judgment, when he's supposed to be, or when we're led to believe that he is also, he loves us unconditionally. So those two things don't stack up. He also goes on to say that when God was young, he was harsh and vengeful, and he built himself a hell to amuse his favourites. But then he became old, mellow, weary of willing, and finally died of pity. So there's kind of Nietzsche's atheism in a nutshell. Zarathustra chimes in complaining that God got angry when we didn't understand him, but it was clearly his fault for not speaking clearly. It was his fault for not speaking clearly in the first place. And then the quote after that is, and if it was the fault of our ears, why did he give us ears that heard him badly? In short, he created us the way we were and then blamed us for being the way we were. So that's an argument that I guess any atheist has heard before. The next quote was pretty good too. He bungled too much, this potter who had never finished his apprenticeship, but then he wreaked revenge on his pots and creations for having bungled them himself. So yeah, lots of good stuff about atheism there. Zarathustra sends the guy up to his cave and goes on. The next guy he meets is an ugly guy. The next section is called The Ugliest Man. And the man he meets here is obviously ugly. So ugly that Zarathustra can barely stand to look at him. So the man asks Zarathustra to guess who he is. And Zarathustra, after sinking to his knees in pity, so he's feeling this pity which Nietzsche has continually railed against in the book. He sinks to his knees in pity and then stands up and finally gets a hold of himself and says, and correctly identifies this guy as the murderer of God. And the reason is this guy is so ugly that he aroused so much pity in God, who looked with eyes that saw everything. He saw man's depths and ultimate grounds, all his concealed disgrace and ugliness. And it was this pity that this engendered in God that killed him in the end. And this guy is this ugliest man is the image, I guess, is the representation of of all of the disgrace and ugliness that is in humanity, or what he would see as disgrace and ugliness. This ugliest man, anyway, says he left society because he couldn't stand the persecution any longer. But the problem wasn't that people mistreated him. The problem was that he couldn't stand the pity. He couldn't stand their pity. And he says he's glad that Zarathustra didn't react to him the way other people do by throwing him alms and pitying him. Rather, he says Zarathustra's shame honored him. And here is this nice distinction between pity and shame is drawn, and the reason why Nietzsche doesn't like it. Shame is like an honest reaction to failure or misfortune, kind of acknowledging the situation and then being able to move past it in whatever way is most appropriate. Pity, on the other hand, keeps us locked in keeps us locked in the situation because we wish that we could change it. We want to change it. We wish that the situation were otherwise. That's what pity is. It's kind of a it's negative, and it's a constraining emotion. It kind of locks everything up, freezes things, rather than letting us move beyond them. So Zarathustra sends this guy back to his cave, keeps going. The next section is called the Voluntary Bigger. And here he meets a guy talking to a herd of cows. And this guy says he's seeking happiness on earth and wants to learn it from the cows. So the secret, he says, or what he thinks is the secret to happiness, is chewing the cud. No matter what else you achieve, if you fail to learn how to do this, he thinks, you'll never overcome your melancholy. So this guy was rich, gave it all up, and he says the rich aren't happy, but neither are the poor. Living like the cows, that is, abstaining from all grave thoughts which bloat the heart, seems to be the secret. So it's hard to say what to make of that. At first I thought, that this guy was mistaken. He wants to, in line with some of the earlier things we've read in this book, chewing the cud, kind of doing nothing, being detaching oneself from life. That's not the answer for Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche wants active engagement. But, so that was what I first thought. This guy's barking up the wrong tree. And maybe that's true as well. But at the end here, abstaining from all grave thoughts which bloat the heart, that's definitely something that Nietzsche would get behind. He's anti that attitude of seriousness and gravity that characterizes so many people, he thought, in his time. And now, right? So anyway, this guy goes back to Zarathustra's cave and he continues. And the last guy Zarathustra comes across is in the next section called The Shadow, where he meets his shadow, who is, like Zarathustra, a wanderer, always on my way, but without any goal, also without any home. So this guy is just kind of totally free, nothing concerns him anymore, but he can't even love himself. He doesn't have any kind of attachments or connections. He's just homeless, a wanderer. And yeah, in many ways that's like Zarathustra. It's also like Nietzsche, right? It's a reflection of Nietzsche, who was literally in the end a wanderer. He had no state. He wasn't a citizen of any state, so he was literally stateless. Anyway, Zarathustra sends this guy back to his cave. Then the next section's called At Noon. Here Zarathustra wanders on, comes to a tree, takes a nap underneath it, and comes to a realization. Whereas he used to teach how little is sufficient for happiness, he now realizes that actually it is little that makes the best happiness. So a good little thing to come to realize. The next section is called The Welcome. And so he hasn't found the higher man who is in distress, but he heads back to his cave, and the strange thing is now he hears that cry of distress coming from his cave. So he heads on up and realizes that it's not actually one voice crying in distress, but it's all those voices of all the people he met together. And when they all kind of speak together, this sound, this cry of distress comes out, sounding like just a single voice when it's heard from some kind of distance away. So the higher man is actually these 8 men that he's met, plus the soothsayer, I guess. 8 guys plus the soothsayer. So one of the kings, he goes in, and one of the kings says that many people have wondered where Zarathustra had gone and why he hadn't returned. And it's because the men gathered here were all in despair. that he'd gone and hadn't returned, that they then decided to seek him out. So Zarathustra says that, well, he wasn't waiting for them. They are higher men in the sense that they recognize that the low kind of ebb of humanity at the moment, but they're not high enough and strong enough yet for him. There is, he says, there is hidden mob in you too. And even though you may be high and of a higher kind, much in you is crooked and misshapen. There is no smith in the world who could hammer you right and straight for me. So, and this is obviously a reference to the ubermensch and how we aren't, at that level. We're never going to be, but he says they are bridges to the ubermensch, and they're also signs that these highest of men, these most noble of men, are coming, although still some distance in the future. So the next section, they prepare a meal here. It's called the Last Supper, this section. They prepare a meal in which Zarathustra talks about the higher man, and that's the next section, which is called On the Higher Man. So the first thing he says was that it was a mistake to go down and preach in the marketplace because the mob aren't ready. They're unable to hear his words. But he thinks that now that God has died, there is a chance for the higher man to kind of come through. And then his teachings to kind of seep into these people. In doing so, laying the foundation for the ubermensch. So many people, he says, still ask how humanity is to be preserved, and that's their main focus. But this is the wrong question for him, because what he wants to know rather is, how is man to be overcome? Again, he's thinking long term. He's thinking at the ubermensch. He's not concerned with the mob, with people now. His concern is, how can we overcome man as he is, or humanity as we are today, and get to the ubermensch. And the quote is, not man, not the neighbor, not the poorest, not the most ailing, not the best. That is, his concern isn't for these people. He's only interested in the ubermensch. So he goes on to reaffirm things that we've heard before. Humans must be more evil and suffer more and harder trials. Remember, that's another common theme. We develop ourselves, we become strong, we become better able to deal with other problems and obstacles. He also says people shouldn't will beyond their capacity. So we shouldn't deceive ourselves into thinking we're better than we are. And he calls us being false, and says that this has a negative consequence in that these counterfeiters and actors, because they're pretending to be something they're not actually doing, they're not actually acting the way that someone who was really these things would act. And with that, they're maligning the character of the best that they're pretending to be. So we shouldn't will beyond our capacity, because we just give whatever it is that we're pretending to be a bad name. We damage that the image, the reputation of whatever it is that we're acting. It was interesting to see here too that Nietzsche says, and I'll quote it for you, what the mob once learned to believe without reasons, who could overthrow that with reasons? So that, I'm not sure if he was the first who said that, but I've heard that argument used against religion in particular before. People didn't reason themselves into Christianity or or any religion, right? You don't really reason yourself into a religion, therefore you can't reason someone out of a religion. I thought it was interesting to see that pop up here in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Then he goes on to say that if we want to go high, if we want to be great and noble, we must use our own legs and not be carried up. Otherwise, when we stand on our own 2 feet, obviously we won't be able to handle the situations up at that new elevation, wherever it is. So this is one reason why he rejects that doctrine for the neighbor. Because basically no matter what you do, you can't create for them. And that's the only thing that counts. That's the only thing that has value. And instead, by helping them, by letting them lean on you, by being a crutch for them, you make them dependent on you. And then if you, in turn, help them up to some new level, some new height, keeping the metaphor going, then they're not going to be able to thrive up there because they didn't get there on their own. He also talks a lot here about joy, laughter, and dancing, as opposed to the gnashing of teeth, which you might have heard somewhere before. Especially, he says, we must be able to laugh at ourselves. So, that is Nietzsche's discourse on the higher man. Okay, so let's keep moving. The Song of Melancholy is the next section. And here, Zarathustra disappears, steps outside for some air, and when he does, the magician gets up and sings a sad song about futility and how nothing is worthwhile. And he draws everyone in the cave into his kind of mood here, and succeeds in putting a dampener down on everything. The next section is on science, and we're coming to the end, so not much longer to go. On science, the conscientious in spirit. Remember that guy Zarathustra met, who called himself the conscientious in spirit, the guy with the leeches. He leaps up, grabs the harp off the magician, and launches into his own speech about how he came to Zarathustra seeking security. He thinks that fear is the original and basic feeling of humans, and that all of human history can be explained as a response to this deep-seated fear. And in fact, that was the reason he thinks that we invented science, just to put ourselves at ease, just to dispel this fear that we have. Zarathustra comes in partway through this speech and disagrees completely. It's courage, he says, not fear, that defines our prehistory. Fear is an anomaly in humans, and as we know, Zarathustra/Nietzsche is all about courage, strength, positive kind of characteristics, traits. The next section is among daughters of the wilderness. Zarathustra's shadow grabs the harp and sings his own song. Unfortunately, I really can't get anything out of this. It just seems like there's not much to talk about here. And Walter Kaufmann, the guy who translated the edition I have, also confirms, he also says that, I'll quote it, it can and should be read as thoroughly delightful nonsense. So there you go. The next section is the awakening. Zarathustra slips out once more and reflects on the fact that, or reflects on how, or despite the fact that he was overcome by a slight aversion and scorn for his company, he enjoyed their gaiety. And he was pleased to see the spirit of gravity retreating. So that's cool, so he's feeling good. But then the noise stops. Zarathustra smells burning incense coming from the cave. And when he goes in, he's shocked to see that everybody is kneeling before the donkey, the ass, and worshipping it. Sorry. So yeah, they're kneeling before this this idol they've constructed in the form of the donkey. And the ugliest man is even reciting a prayer to the animal. The next section is the ass festival. So Zarathustra gets in there and he tells them all off, kicked by one, and then he finally kicks them out. But he does recognize something positive in this situation, namely that they created this ass festival themselves. And so he urges them to celebrate it when they next do, but do it for their own sakes. So he's not that happy about this idea that they're worshipping this animal, but there is something good in it, and that is that they've at least decided to create this value for themselves. They've decided to value the donkey, and it was their decision. So that gives, even though what they're worshipping isn't perhaps what Zarathustra would want them to worship, or what he would worship himself, at least they've created this themselves. So, and that's what the whole thing's about, right? That's what's kind of underpinning this whole book, is that idea of creation, and Nietzsche's whole philosophy is that idea of will to power, creating for yourself, creating your own values. That lies at the core of Nietzsche's philosophy. Okay, so we've got two sections left. The next one is the Drunken Song. And here they all go outside the cave. The ugliest man rejoices, saying that he's completely satisfied, finally, for the first time in his life, not just with this day, but he's satisfied with his whole life. And the quote is, "Living on earth is worthwhile. One day, one festival with Zarathustra taught me to love the earth." So obviously what's happening here is this ugliest man has finally accepted, or understood and accepted, the doctrine of eternal recurrence. Was that life? I want to say to death, well then, once more. So he's affirming life and everything that came with it. Each of Zarathustra's guests for that night thank him, expressing similar sentiments. So they've come to grips with this idea of the doctrine of eternal recurrence, which is one of the main themes of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So in this section, from sections 3 to 12, in this chapter from sections 3 to 12, Zarathustra discourses about the eternal recurrence, explaining the section at the end of the third part, if you remember, was called the Other Dancing Song, and that had short notes, or a short sentence or line for each, it was like a poem, a verse, but with like 12, I think, short verses. And these sections 3 to 12 in this chapter, the Drunken Song, they just flesh out what that was about. Okay, stop. I'm talking too much about that. Okay, essentially this whole section is an ode to eternal recurrence, rejecting the response to suffering that says no and seeks for a way out. So there's that. So he's against that idea of no, trying to change things, or to reject whatever comes one's way, and instead affirming the response that says yes, and that embraces joy, thereby embracing all suffering as well, because you can't have one without the other. And that's one of the key points, I think, to understanding the doctrine of eternal recurrence. It says yes, and in saying yes to anything, it necessarily requires you to say yes to everything. So you can say yes to the good, but you're also saying yes to the bad. And it's only someone who can affirm like that who has understood and accepted this doctrine of eternal recurrence. If you just say yes to all the good, but no to the bad, then you've failed to grasp or to realize the importance of the doctrine of eternal recurrence. You've failed to fully affirm what Nietzsche is getting at, what Zarathustra is getting at. The quote here is, "Have you ever said yes to a single joy? Oh, my friends, then you said yes to all woe. All things are entangled, ensnared, enamored. If ever you wanted one thing twice, if ever you said, you please me happiness, abide moment, then you wanted all back, all anew, all eternally, all entangled, ensnared, enamored. Oh, then you loved the world." So that's the doctrine of eternal recurrence right there. And the last section is called the sign. The next morning, Zarathustra is out sitting on a stone in front of his cave. A whole flight of doves flap and flutter around him. And in the midst of this, a lion appears, remembering the lion from the beginning of the Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He recognizes these as the sign that he was waiting for. And both of these were foretold in the first section of On Old and New Tablets in the third part of the book. So his guests come out of the cave, and at this moment, and then they see the lion, which was previously tame when it was only with Zarathustra, and it suddenly savagely roars at them. So Zarathustra sits back down, reflecting on things that have happened, and he realizes that yesterday he was in this exact same spot when the soothsayer prophesied the call of distress from the higher man, with which he wanted to tempt and seduce Zarathustra to his final sin. What was the sin? I've already told you actually, but the sin was pity, right? But not pity for the mob of humanity, not pity for the crowd, pity for the higher man. And finally, Zarathustra realizes he's faced and overcome his final obstacle, this pity for the higher man, for the bridge to the overman, to the ubermensch, and his great noon is arriving. Zarathustra leaves his cave, glowing and strong as a morning sun that comes out of dark mountains. And we're done. So that is the fourth part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I've gone through it in quite a bit of detail. I'm going to do one more video on this, a shorter one, and I'm just going to outline some of the key ideas that you really need to take away from the book. Cool. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you shortly for that final video.